Right. Hello, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. Thank you for joining this session called Truth Be Told, Fighting Fake News and Sharing Reliable Information. My name is Nina Lamparski. I work for the AFP News Agency and manage their fact-checking division in Africa. I'm honored to be your host today. Before we start, a quick reminder that this session will last exactly 60 minutes, after which the live stream will be cut off. Of course, we want to hear from you, so please use the live chat to send your questions directed at one or all of the panelists, and we shall answer them at the end during the Q&A. Now, it's no secret that the pandemic has given rise to a huge amount of misinformation. At best, misinformation is obvious and may even be comical, like a badly photoshopped picture or a clumsy video edit. At worst, however, misinformation kills. It can worsen political tensions, spark real-life violence, or push people to make bad health decisions, as we have seen over and over again during the pandemic. My four guests today are seasoned warriors in the battle against misinformation. They will showcase solutions that seek to cut through the noise, provide people with accurate information, and rebuild media trust. First up, it's my pleasure to introduce Paulina Ibarra, the Executive Director of Fundación Multitudes, based in Chile, and Chairwoman of the Civil Society Pillar of the Community of Democracies. Paulina will share her insights into a crucial project which tracks and analyzes misinformation targeting women involved in politics in Latin America. Next, we have Dr. Benjamin Judal-Bey, a public health and infectious disease specialist who heads the Division of Policy, Health, Diplomacy, and Communication at the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The Africa CDC spearheads a mass messaging project which brings accurate COVID-19 news to millions of people living in remote communities. Our third panelist, David Hidalgo, is an award-winning reporter and non-fiction author and the news director of Ojo Público, an investigative journalism association in Peru. He's here to discuss the first independent initiative aimed at getting COVID-19 information to indigenous peoples in the Andes and the Amazon. And finally, Lawrence Pintack is also an award-winning journalist, author, and media development expert. He is the Dean of the Graduate School of Media and Communications at the renowned Aga Khan University. The school's Informed Society initiative helps educate students on how to separate fact from fiction and promotes journalism training. Now, my first question goes to you, Lawrence. To know how to fight misinformation, you need to know what you're up against and understand the phenomenon. So can you tell us what might cause people to fall for misinformation in the first place?
Well, part of it is simply not understanding the background of the context. Seeing something on a feed, on a Facebook feed that's from a friend of yours or someone you think might know what they're talking about, and just accepting that as fact. Reading something in a newspaper or seeing something on TV that seems credible, but actually isn't. And that's why it's so critical to understand where information comes from, help people to understand what goes into gathering information, and ask them or teach them to ask questions.
Now, people often use the phrase fake news, but fact checkers actually prefer to say misinformation because basically if something is fake and not based on facts, it's not news, it is misinformation. Can you tell us a little bit more about the sort of different types of misinformation and why perhaps you yourself might not like the phrase fake news?
Well, I'm with you. Fake news is an invention of Donald Trump, and all we do is buy into his framing of the news media. It has nothing to do with news. It has to do with disinformation, which is purposeful, misleading factoids, shall we say, that are presented as fact. Or it's misinformation, which is simply people misunderstanding something and forwarding something that is not true. So it's critical for us to separate this and drop use of this term, even though it's in the title of our session, because it just fuels the ability of tyrants around the world to label anything that they don't like as fake.
And what might be motivations behind spreading the spread of what might be motivation behind the spread of misinformation? Like, who are the actors potentially?
There are countless actors. My research team did a study of disinformation around one of the American congressional candidates, Ilhan Omar, who ended up in Congress, and we looked at Islamophobia in the tweets around her. 70% of what was online in her ecosystem was misinformation or disinformation about Muslims. And we tracked it back to Russians, Israelis, right-wing organizations, even Saudi Arabia, which didn't want an uppity woman in Congress. So there are many, many motivations. Governments produce misinformation and disinformation. We saw this with Facebook pulling accounts that were run by the Ugandan government during the last election. Anti-vaxxers, obviously right now, that's a huge source of mis and disinformation. And a lot of it, as we say, is misinformation because it started as disinformation, but individuals not understanding what they were seeing fed that along, and it became misinformation. So there are countless people who want to undermine truth.
And then, of course, there's also just people who I guess don't stop for a second and sort of think about what they're looking at. And we're all in the habit of just sharing news very quickly via our social media apps. So there's also just sort of, it's not always evil intent behind, I guess, or sort of a targeted intent. Sometimes you just don't check what you don't verify
Right,
information.
Absolutely. And this is why it's so critical to verify that. In various of these studies of disinformation and misinformation online, we often find that it's coming from a handful of individual accounts, but then it's being transmitted on by thousands or hundreds of thousands of people who simply don't know any better.
Right. So my next question goes to Paulina. Thank you for that. My next question goes to Paulina. So Paulina, your organization has launched a Women's Observatory Against Disinformation, which focuses on a very specific type of misinformation. Can you expand on the nature of the project and why it is needed in the first place?
Sure, thank you. First, let me thank Lawrence for actually making this discrimination between disinformation and fake news, which is truly real. We, the Fundación Multitudes, started the Women Observatory Against Disinformation and Fake News to particularly focus on the issue of disinformation targeting women in electoral processes. That has a huge impact on democratic processes because many women actually are discouraged from participating of electoral processes when they are victims of disinformation and fake news. Particularly because disinformation campaigns actually affect them in a more personal level. And one of the main issues about disinformation particularly is that it's not really related to the issue of online gender violence when targeting women. So this has multiple layers, from the impact on democratic processes, the impact towards women participating in electoral processes, the lack of knowledge, the lack of data, particularly in the region where we work, where we currently work, Latin America. And so there are it's a multi-layer phenomenon that is really, in some cases, misunderstood. Because again, it doesn't really look into the huge impact that may have not only on women, but in democratic processes as well as globally.
And Paulina, why would somebody want to target women specifically in politics? Why women?
Well, for multiple reasons. There is, as you know, there is a gender campaign against women, that we've seen that happening everywhere. If we look just back at the starting of the COVID pandemic, if many of you might recall that there was right around March 2020, that's the COVID fog, and there were many news outlets, unfortunately, offline, online, that were talking about how the Women's March was actually helping spread COVID around the world. So you have that particularly. But secondly, is because when disinformation targets women, it has the specific purpose of position women of incapable of public life. And in order to have safe and sound democracies around the world, we need to include more women. Nowadays, only about 25% around the world are actually participating in electoral processes and public life. So if we look at this phenomenon, we know that the most underserved group by democracy are actually women. Not having women participating in electoral processes will prevent women from actually participating of policy changing from other processes. And we also know that when we have more women participating in electoral processes, we also have lower level of corruption and higher level of benefits in terms of education and health. So disinformation does not have only impact on women, it has an impact on democratic processes as a whole. And as I mentioned, in the particular issue, for example, of Latin America, we know that the COVID pandemic pushed women's rights back for about 10 years. And we don't know how we're going to recover that. So it is important that we focus on data so we can actually prevent and combat disinformation, but also change policy around the region to help women achieve a better status than currently we have.
So your work is primarily not only, but heavily focused on sort of the impact on policy making.
Well, our research looks at having an impact on policy making, so we can prevent disinformation against women participating of electoral processes, but also preventing disinformation as a whole, so it doesn't have the impact that currently it has on democratic processes. And as we've seen, it's very difficult to actually recognize and to identify who starts this type of campaigns. In so many cases, it can be outside the country to destabilize the system. I can offer you a good example of currently happening in Chile. As I'm sure you know, we are going through a constitutional process when we're going to redesign the constitution that was written during the Pinochet dictatorship. And the most affected person in that convention, which was elected by a popular vote, is the president of the convention, who is actually a woman. And she has been tremendously impacted, and with that, the legitimacy of that institution. If we fail to keep that legitimacy of the conventional constitution in Chile, then there are going to be a lot of questions about whether or not the next constitution is actually legitimate. And it represents what's happening in Chile and what all citizens want to happen in Chile.
Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you, Paulina. We'll circle back to the discussion of prevention of misinformation that you touched upon just then. We'll come to that in a little bit. And now, David, to counter misinformation, it's essential to reach as many people as possible, including the most marginalized ones, those living in really remote communities. So how do you manage to provide information to isolated regions where people live who may not have access to new information technologies, for example?
Well, thank you. And it's an honor for me to be here. Thank you very much for giving this opportunity to my experience. Of course, at the beginning of the pandemic in Peru, there were some claims by the organizations of original peoples in Peru that were claiming for information and healthcare services. We took those claims and prepared a project that provides information, reliable information, based on fact-check reports prepared by a team of journalists in Lima, the team of journalists of Ojo Público. And we prepared some versions specifically for these people that live in very remote areas and that have very poor conditions of living. And we consider this a matter of not just a problem of communication, a problem of giving them reliable information, but a matter of human rights. We consider that original people have the human rights to receive reliable and timely information in order to save their life, in order to survive, because as we know now, this was a situation that put in risk the lives of not the people in the cities, but also the people in remote areas as the indigenous peoples. So we prepare with the counseling of anthropologists, linguists, physicians, even musicians, with the counseling of these experts in order to prepare some understandable content related to COVID and the pandemic, to provide them some useful information to prevent the contagion and to be more prepared for receiving this situation. And we prepared this content, we translated and worked with some interpreters in order to prepare a more understandable content. But you need to understand this. It's difficult to prepare some content of new knowledge in another language that has, for example, no words for scientists or evidence. You need to understand the cultural relevance of the content that you have to provide to these people. And this was the key element of the project, that we understood that we need to work with cultural relevance in order to provide useful information for the people that has poor access to education, to access to healthcare services, and of course are distrustful of the state because they live in zones affected, for example, by oil and mining industries, provided by the state and promoted by the state, and with no consultation and in their territories, and they're facing some threats to their territories, their cultures, and in this situation they are very distrustful of every information that comes from outside their territories. We need to overcome those that distrustful and preparing this information. I think that we could help to these people to be able to survive to this crisis.
And you were saying that these are people who are living in extremely remote areas. So the information that you're sort of bringing to them is brought in podcasts, for example. But how do they actually then get the information? Like, how do they listen to it?
Yeah, we organized a network of regional radio stations that spread and broadcasted this content, because that's the only way that information could get to these people. And in some areas, not even the radio is enough to reach those regions, because they only have, for example, some megaphones to receive the information in the center of the town. They don't even get the radio signal, so it's very difficult. Those are very difficult conditions to receive information, but we need to overcome those situations with the alliance of these regional communicators and broadcasters in those Andean and the Amazon regions.
Okay, thank you very much, David. Now, Benjamin, you are also busy getting a lot of information, getting COVID-19 information to people living in semi-urban and rural communities across Africa. Now, that must require a huge collaborative effort. Can you tell us a bit more about how you managed to do this in different languages and media formats, and who's involved in the project?
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for this opportunity to make our work known. When the COVID pandemic started, we needed to respond to the infodemic that was raging heavily at that time. And for us, the challenge was ensuring that the fact-based information were available to people, and at the same time, at the same rate that the disinformation and fake news were being churned out. And our strategy was to leverage citizens' agency and put citizens at the center of information generation and dissemination. And we did a few things. I will mention three of them. The first thing that we did is to providing information directly to people where they are. and we leverage technologies that were accessible to people already using various interesting formats. So we believe that moment was not the one for introducing new platforms, and particularly for the mass of the people. We relied on tools such as SMS, mobile internet hotspots, web pages, WhatsApp, Facebook, also harness the abilities of Africa's growing tech ecosystem to get this information to citizens in their local languages. And to achieve this, we use the decentralization information approach, which help to get information out in about 20 languages at the same time. So the 8 startups we work with in various regions of Africa were able to develop information in the dominant languages in the environments. Like we use in Nigeria, Hausa, Igbo, we use Yoruba, etc. In Kenya, for instance, we use Swahili, in Rwanda, Burundi, etc. The dominant languages in these areas. And the third thing that we did also for us was the last mile communication. That was the major focus. That is the reaching people in semi and urban rural areas where these fake news were prevalent and needed to be addressed in order to avoid even more dangerous incidents. And reaching these people require bridging the traditional with the new. The traditional media with the news media system that were in place. And our partner startups were able to engage local media outlets, community engagement, and also local influencers to increase the reach and to spread their information materials. And this reinforces the point about ensuring that our use of technology should not be at the risk of the good or all offline methodologies. So perhaps the point to make about leveraging technologies is that the policymakers need to work with locals. We have seen it in this pandemic, and the nature of policy-based or public organization is that they are bureaucratic. And if we had to set out to do this internally ourselves, it will have taken a long time, and maybe even as I'm speaking, we wouldn't have done anything and to respond to the challenge timelessly. And however, the collaboration with the 8 startup gave us an agility to respond immediately and to come up with various information materials using many means and platforms at the same time. So this is what we have done. And it is not the subject of this talk, but we also set up what we call a rumor tracking system in place. And every week we track all the rumors across the continent, and we have a team that is responding to the different rumors that we identified in Africa, and we try also to reach out to the countries or to the communities where these rumors are coming out, in the specific messages. Thank you.
And they move very fast, rumors, so they spread very quickly. So I guess it's an important action to take. I have a question for you. You mentioned challenges as well. Now, one of the things that we noticed during the pandemic, the fight against COVID-19 in certain African countries was hampered by public distrust towards the authorities, for example, because there was already sort of a climate of distrust in general now with COVID. Even though the government tried to relay accurate information, it didn't necessarily mean that people actually took it on board. How do you overcome that type of obstacle in your own campaign?
I think the public authorities have a huge role to play, and it should be done in a multi-stakeholders approach. And this is what we have done. When we come to a country, what we do, we not only work with the authorities, but we have a kind of bottom-up and top-down approaches. We combine these strategies. For instance, I can take an example. What is happening currently in Cameroon, for instance? We are using the heavily what we call the community engagement. And we identify within the communities, the community leaders, For instance, they can be religious leaders, they can be musicians, they can be any type of influencers in the communities. And we bring also the authorities, local authorities together, and we can have a focus group to discuss what are the challenges, why there is this mistrust, and what are the messages that we can, all using our own language, the language that we, for instance, the politician will not speak the language of a musician or the language of the community or a religious leader. So everyone, but it is the message that is going out is the same message that is going out, but being utilized or reaching out to the people according to their own language, the way they speak. So that is what we did, and it is proving to work very well. But as you know, every day, every second, rumors are coming out, and we spend our time really debating, all these things. But there is no one solution fit all. We have different strategies into different settings. Thank you.
Which is kind of what we have to do. I think that's like the fight against misinformation. It's there are many tentacles out there trying to sort of tackle the problem. Now, when we talk about governments, and this is a question I'd like to address to all of the panelists today, we have seen it in various places. We have seen it in Africa. We've seen it across Latin America. Governments have brought in laws which claim to crack down on misinformation, but are actually seen by some to be used to silence opposition members or critics of the government. So my question to you would be, what role should the state play in the fight against misinformation? Is state intervention compatible with the protection of free speech? Maybe I can give the floor to Lawrence. Oh, Lawrence, I think, are you possibly muted?
I was indeed.
It had to happen. It had to happen to somebody. Glad it's you and not me for once. So go ahead.
No, I was saying that coincidentally, ironically, whatever, I just took your role, moderated the panel on challenging content, the issue of what is disturbing content, et cetera. And this is the ultimate question: what role should governments play? And sadly, we heard the ambassador from Denmark talk about the overt and positive role of governments in some parts of the world, like hers. But clearly, we all know that in other parts of the world, governments play an insidious role. We need to look no further than Egypt, for example. Yesterday, a Rwandan YouTube star, essentially, was jailed for saying stuff the government didn't like, because, of course, it was, quote, fake news. And this is what we keep seeing, particularly since the COVID crisis began. That gave authoritarian governments another reason to crack down on journalists, bloggers, human rights activists, whomever, who were criticizing how the governments were dealing with the issue. So it's a big, big problem. There are governments out there that play a very positive role, but the temptation, of course, for governments that are less than democratic is to use this as a bludgeon. The flip side of this is that's why the role of the media is so important. If journalists can't accurately convey information and call out mis and disinformation, that's a problem. In the global north, in Europe, in the US, media have terrible credibility, way down on the popularity scale. But in parts of the developing world, they have very high credibility. Kenya, where our university is based, had the media there has an off-the-charts positive credibility levels. But then that makes it that much worse when they just give credibility to what is in fact mis and disinformation, not consciously, but through a failure to understand the stories themselves. So it's essential for anyone who is caring about this issue to work with the media, to raise the awareness of the media, educate the media around critical issues. And so, for example, what the CDC is doing right now in Africa, the Africa CDC, Benjamin's organization, is in part communicating and helping journalists to better understand this issue. There was a story in the Standard in Kenya a couple of months ago that epitomized the problem. The headline was misinformation about COVID. And in fact, that's what the story was. It was complete and utter misinformation about COVID. They had done everything wrong. They had interviewed some woman who claimed she was a doctor, who isn't a doctor, who just spewed anti-vaccine venom through the entire article, interviewed no one else. Now, that wasn't a journalist setting out to spread mis or disinformation. That was just simply not an educated journalist on the issue. Now you're muted.
It had to happen. Thank you, Lawrence. I was just saying thank you for this. I was wondering if one of my other panelists would like to comment on this as well. Maybe Paulina.
Yeah, I was just mentioning, if I may add to what Lawrence was saying, and it's the issue with governance. I mean, again, multi-layered situation. We need multi-stakeholders partnership to kind of combat the issue of disinformation. The problem with different governments around the globe is that they're focusing on sanctioning, and that's a real issue. As Lawrence mentioned it, we've seen how in many countries, and I can provide multiple examples in Latin America and the Caribbean, Nicaragua and Brazil being two of the most worst examples when it comes to sanctioning, is that governments are using the concept of fake news with a very much political chart, where if they don't like what the opposition is saying, they're using it to say, this is fake news, guess what? We're going to sanction you. And you're going to go to jail for 6 years in Nicaragua and some other years in Brazil. So the main issue with governments that are serious about combating disinformation and fake news is that they have to focus on prevention, but furthermore on education. Because when we start looking into sanctioning, then we're going into the issue of the right to access to information, the right to inform, and the right to a free press. So governments need to focus first on working very closely with social media platforms, which unfortunately up to now, there have been taking a more reactive than proactive approach. And in some cases, that reactiveness can impact the issue of freedom of speech, where we've seen also in some cases that a social media platform probably takes some content down that is absolutely valid because there has been a more reactive than proactive policy. And also, governments need to work on making social media responsible for what is being published, making sure that there is a due diligence process in place, and working on educating citizens so they better understand what's news and what's not news and what's disinformation and what are the different impacts of these different phenomena, which right now that does not exist. If I ask a normal citizen, a regular citizen, if they know what disinformation is, they're probably going to talk fake news. They're probably going to talk, well, with a newspaper publishes something that is not news, which is basically an oxymoron. We know that media outlets, respectable and serious media outlets, are going to report on fact. So basically, they don't know what this information is. They don't know that in the case of targeting women, it is a form of online gender violence. And they don't know basically what are the repercussions of that. And on the other hand, governments don't know how to track this phenomenon. It is very difficult to basically identify what is the purpose and the intention of someone publishing or helping misspread this information. And they're not working with the right partners. They're really not working with parliamentarians. They're not working with civil society. They're just taking measures on their own to basically combat once it's happening and not preventing that phenomenon from continue happening and impacting their own institutions.
Thank you, Paulina. Well, we've seen certainly some interesting developments in various countries where governments have actually started to adopt fact-checking. They're doing their own fact-checking, so they've created official platforms as part of the government website. They're calling it State Fact Check, and essentially use like a stamp in the way that fact-checkers often do. You will have seen this if you use, any of the social media platforms. You might have seen sort of a fake news or a fake sort of stamp across an image, and they're doing that, but actually there's no debunk happening. There's no fact-check happening. There's no sort of empirical forensic verification going on. It is really just something to silence opponents in that case. So which also raises the question, I mean, Lawrence mentioned it earlier, there is not just one type of person spreading or one type of entity spreading misinformation. It can be the authorities, as we've seen, it can be citizens, it can be the media. Now, kind of does the strategy to fight misinformation then differ depending on who spreads it? Again, this is a question to perhaps, David, you would like to tackle this.
Yeah, I wanted to start mentioning something about what you were saying, that it's real. And I can give you an example. In the last process, in the electoral process in Peru, that was at the beginning of the 2021, the electoral authorities launched a technical committee focused on fact-checking in order to prevent the misinformation that was spreading, coming from all the political actors and competitors in the election. And it was useful at the moment, but it also enters in this conversation about if the state should to be working on fact-checking to provide information that comes from the state. So I would say that I agree with Paulina that the main focus of the state, of the government, should be on education and not just on providing information because it could have the bias of being such a public office to providing information and to deny or give information biased by functionaries in the state. So it's different. Yes, I would say that it's different because you need to consider what's the background of the people who is providing this information. You need to understand that the sources of the misinformation could be, for example, organizations that have another agenda, conservative agenda, that are promoting, for example, false cures about COVID, and that use this misinformation to attack organizations like OMS, for example, the Organización Mundial de la Salud, World Health Organization, in order to prepare the floor to attack them when it comes to another issues like, for example, gender rights, the rights of women, the rights of reproductive rights, and they are the same people that are promoting different kinds of misinformation with an agenda behind. So, but when it comes from just some satirical media that provides some information that pretends to be a joke, for example, and some people believes in that situation and spreads it because they think that it's information, real information. You need to have another strategy to work with that situation and to fact check that information. So I agree with you that you need to prepare different strategies in order to detect the information or misinformation and to work and fact check it and provide the real information to the people.
So today, in what you're saying, I mean, it seems like we're really facing an uphill battle in many ways. I mean, misinformation isn't new, propaganda isn't new, the way people try to sort of push their own agenda, especially in times of heightened political tension, it's not new. But it does seem in some ways, because of social media, that we're really facing a much, much bigger fight. We have a much bigger fight in our hands than before because of the way information sort of spreads so quickly. So where do you kind of think, in terms of, so for example, for Benjamin, the CDC has dealt with other outbreaks, has obviously deals with outbreaks of diseases and gets information to people. Is the current, is it harder with COVID-19 to get people to react and to sort of take on board advice on vaccination, for example, or on other sort of, how to handle the disease, how you can catch it? Do you find that people are more distrusting, or is it sort of the same as with in other health campaigns?
Currently, we are fighting two things at the same time. We are fighting the pandemic of COVID-19, and we are fighting the infodemic. So it is a huge challenge. And there is a credibility, especially on the source of the information. So we ensure that at Africa CDC, the information that we are putting out, the information is credible. And it is verifiable, and people can really rely on what we are putting out for them. So I think for now, more than any other time in the story, the democratization of information suggests that there are many new actors in the information space today, right? And with this proliferation of sources, and even if you are putting the right information outside there, somebody will just go and counter it. I'm seeing it regularly, for instance, on our Twitter account, when we release, for instance, a guideline, and we just provide a kind of summary of 2 or 3 bullet points, not to say that, okay, for instance, easing the lockdown, for instance, we release, this is just an example, a guideline for that one. As soon as you leave it, you will see 100 comments coming on that, what is this? This is again another, way of bringing everybody under control. There is this theory of a lot of things are going on. So this should be seen also sometime, as an opportunity rather than a challenge. Opportunity, why? Because it should be a shared responsibility in development and the consumption of information. That is extremely important. And traditional media needs also to adapt with the time and not simply become an amplifier of social media and new media. Sometimes you see what is already in the social media, then you will see it in the traditional either newspaper or on TV. So it is the same information. And in many cases, where the traditional media have been found capable of, even if their credibility is put in question, it is often because they have willfully or unwittingly refused to abide by the ethics and codes of credible media journalism, right? So the journalism essence, for instance, is the discipline of verification, which we don't see it in the social media. We really need, and this is where the role of the public authorities should be that of facilitator of a common response and enforcer of ethic codes and rules of combating fake news. That is what I can say. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, this leads me nicely to another component of this debate, which is education. So we focused on sort of we've talked about the governments, we've talked about the media, we've talked about the distrust towards traditional sources. But there's also something, one of the differences between traditional journalism and fact-checking is that as a fact-checker, you really tell the reader exactly what you've done, what your process is, and you provide them with, you link to tools that they can use. A lot of fact-checking tools are actually free to the general public, and they're quite, on a very basic level, quite easy to use. So what are some of the things, what are the roles? So Lawrence, for example, in your initiative, you're focusing on helping young students to become informed information consumers. What does that look like? How can you teach young children how to spot misinformation?
Sure. You said it when you talked about this torrent of information that we face. In our view, fact-checking is critical in the short term, but there's a degree of the game in the West we call whack-a-mole. Every time you hit one, another one pops up. And so keeping up with that torrent is deeply challenging. I don't need to tell you that. That's where, the other prong of the fight has to be long-term. creating an informed society, informed citizens who were able to, using their own logic, using their own knowledge of the context of history, of their nation, of every aspect of society, be able to put a given supposed fact in that context. And then, yes, absolutely, on a deeper level, use the tools that you're talking about that are available everywhere. How you approach this varies according to the age group. I mean, we are just beginning this project. We're in the pilot stage. So we're training teachers to bring these tools into their classroom, to bring skepticism and critical thinking into their classroom. This is not a new concept. The idea of critical thinking, of critically evaluating what you see, has been around for a very long time. It's been part of curricula at every level of schools, whether we're talking about advertising, how you critically assess that. So this isn't a new concept, but you're bringing to it the concept that as you read the news, you should be applying these. And we're beginning our work with high school age students, not 5 years old. It's a very different thing there. Though there are ways to begin to do that. But when you concentrate on students who are becoming more aware of the world around them, who are hopefully beginning to consume the news on their own, and certainly they are consuming information on these things, but no matter where they are in the world, they're consuming this kind of information. And so helping them to, showing them images and asking them, what do you think this image is? Do you think it really shows this? And then helping them to understand how to look at that and figure out what, if not what it is, what it might not be. Is this really what they say it is? Is what they're telling you in this story, does that fit in with what your parents have told you, with what your teachers have told you, the context of what's going on in your country? So all of these pieces go together. It's very different if you're educating university students or graduate students, where and I've taught courses on this, where you dive right into the tools and the reverse image searches and all of those sorts of things. But you're also putting it in the context, in all of these situations, in the context of historical propaganda. Because as you said earlier, this stuff isn't new. Governments and politicians and soap manufacturers have tried to twist our view of things since the dawn of man. What is different now is that it's not being filtered through the media, where there was some level of gatekeeping sometimes. It's right there, again, right there in front of you 24 hours a day. And that just ramps up the challenges of approaching this.
Thank you, Lawrence. Now, I'm looking at the time. We've got roughly 12 minutes left. It looks like the Q&A is currently, my queue seems a bit empty. So please, for anyone who's out there in the audience, feel free to send us your questions. We are still at your disposal for another sort of 10 minutes or so. So, Lawrence, from what you were just talking about now, do you think, all of you think that the echo chamber effect is perhaps bigger today than it has been before? So people sort of sitting in their bubble and insisting that their view is there's something about we find in our daily work, there's something very emotive in the way that people respond to news today. So it isn't no longer just, even if you prove to somebody, for example, you can give them facts, real facts, so something that they really cannot contest, and they will still reply in a way or respond in a way that will reject what you're saying. Because it doesn't quite fit into their narrative. Now, there's no right or wrong narrative. I'm not saying that this isn't about sort of who's right and who's wrong. But do you think that the echo chamber today has grown much bigger and it's harder to break out of it than it has been perhaps in the past?
Absolutely and utterly. And let me just quickly say, absolutely and utterly. I'm a former American TV correspondent. And it used to be that when there were 3 or 4 major networks, we all had a shared worldview. Or we all read the same newspapers, and we understood that we agreed that the sky is blue and it's raining outside. But now we can't even agree on the sky being blue because those people in our echo chamber are telling us it's brown. And if you don't have a common starting point, I was going to say, if you don't have a common starting point for a debate, you have no debate.
Yes. Does one of the other panelists want to join in on that?
Yes, but I'm not sure if you can hear me. Can you hear me? Yes,
I can
hi.
hear you. Yes,
so I wanted to piggyback in what Lawrence was saying in terms of, unfortunately, the pandemic has put on us in like I said, in an echo chamber where we are just potentially looking at different issues happening and believing that it's true because we can't see outside our own walls. So that's a real problem. But one of the main issues that you were talking before was the issue of fact-checking. And what is extremely important is just not enough. Once this information has hit the rest of the world, the after-truth sets in, and it's very difficult to change the perception and the knowledge that is already been established out there and that is perceived by citizens. So, and that gets really even worse as a phenomenon now with the pandemic. So we really need to look more into how we can prevent, not just fact checking, I think is very important, but we really need to start teaching citizens to learn what is due diligence, to really proactively make sure that whatever they're hearing nowadays is double checked, that we make sure that it's coming from a reliable source. And while I understand that the issue is not fully in the media, unfortunately, sometimes media uses this information to communicate as a news. If we're saying so-and-so has been victim of disinformation or fake news, what I've seen, particularly in the Latin American region, is then traditional or more respectful media outlets putting this on the newspaper, and with that, kind of changing the perception of citizens in terms of what's real and what's not real. So that is a very important issue that needs to be discussed through education, and that education needs to permeate in all different aspects of life, whether it's with young children like Lauren's project, whether it's with media, whether it is with original population communities, whether it's with women. We need to make sure that we don't get to let the after-truth settles, but we really are making sure that we're not permitting content that we know is not real. So that's one of the main important things. And like I said, fact-checking is important, but if we don't take that to the next level, if we don't work with policymakers, making sure that this doesn't continue happening, it just is not, it's not worth enough in itself.
And I mean, maybe also it's worth to tag on to what you're saying. It's worth pointing out that perhaps also one difference between traditional journalism, I mean, fact-checking is journalism, but perhaps one of the difference is that with fact-checking is that there's really a huge collaborative effort. In all of your projects that you've discussed here today, it's really all about reaching out to others. You cannot do it on your own. And anytime that you work as a fact-checker on a story, you know that it is only the tip of the iceberg, because fundamentally whatever we're seeing is only what people have flagged or what we found. But there is obviously an entire ocean of it beneath us and around us. So I think this is all about fact-checking organizations also often collaborate together. They come together and they sort of really share information, they share techniques, because otherwise it's going to be very difficult to kind of win this battle. Not that we'll ever win it, but perhaps in a very optimistic way, can I ask, do you think, to all of four of you, do you think we'll get on top of it at any point? Do you think that in 10, 15, 20 years' time, we'll look back on this period as a transition in the way we handle misinformation, the way it gets created? And do you think one side or the other will sort of emerge stronger? What's your outlook? Is it a bit more optimistic?
I want to say something about this. I want to say something that one of the main challenges for fact checkers has been to know if the fact checking really is really useful. It really prevents that people think the way they think and the way that you were saying before. And in the last year, there was a very interesting study prepared by an Argentine organization, Chequeado, and prepared by two scholars that found that after analyzing all the data of the recent years of fact-checking and the reaction of the people, they found that the people that thinks in one way, in one extreme way, probably won't change the way they were thinking if you publish a story that says that, for example, their candidate is saying something that is false. But they were stopped to avoid that content because they know now that it's false. It's a very little but important step to be conscious that the fact-checking has at least one effect that could be expanded in the future. And I'm really optimistic of the future because one of the goals of this practice should be to develop a culture of verification, that it involves the education programs to prepare the children to know that they need to verificate and to fact check all the content that they are seeing in their social networks, for example, and even in the news and every aspect of their life. And we are in that way. This is a growing movement. Some years ago, there were just 10 fact-checking organizations in the world, and now we are more than 300, for example. And I think that this is a practice that more people is talking about. Even the authorities, even the governments, even the multilateral organizations are talking about misinformation, but also about fact-checking as a useful tool for prevent this situation.
Great, thank you. I'm pleased that you're saying you're optimistic. That's 1 out of 4. What about my other guests? How do you feel?
I actually feel very optimistic, and I wanted to clarify the issue of fact-checking because I do feel that it's a very strong tool, but it's not the only tool. So when I talk about due diligence, to me, it's creating that culture of making sure that whatever we're putting out there, we really know the source. We really know where it's coming from. We really kind of learn collectively that it can have an impact if we're publishing something that is definitely not true or that has the intention of positioning someone or something in a different way that it is. So I'm usually very negative about this type of situations and this phenomenon, but I'm positive that as we're seeing, on one hand, countries and governments very utilizing disinformation and fake news as a way to open the door, for example, for right-wing populism. On the other hand, we see governments and consortiums of organizations that are working more into due diligence, into making sure that they are educating, to make sure that disinformation and fake news are not permeating all the different aspects of democratic processes.
Okay, thank you.
Personally,
Thank you, Paulina. And I will tell you.
No, I'm saying personally, I don't think we are getting on top of the issue.
Okay.
I'm saying that personally, I don't think that we are getting on the top of the issue, and the COVID-19 situation is not helping. But the disruption brought about by the technology implies that the legal foundation of media journalism and information business require some reforms, and that is a process that should be inclusive. They should become broader and provide some level of standards in ensuring that objectivity of the methods of information verification before dissemination should be really widely accepted by all. And it requires a lot of pedagogy. We need to train, retrain, and train again.
Education is key. Education is going to be key. I'm going to we'll have to unfortunately stop here. Thank you, Benjamin, because we've got literally 1 minute left, and I would hate it if I didn't get to say thank you to all 4 of you for joining me today. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. I know that I think most of us were not in the same country. I think Paulina and I are. Both here, but I think otherwise we're all spread across the globe, and it's great that we can kind of get together and discuss misinformation. So thank you very much for this debate. Thank you for sharing your insights, and I would just say let's keep up the good fight, basically. So
thank you for moderating today, Nina.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. It's been my absolute pleasure. So hopefully see you soon. All the best to everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.